Okay, so if anybody who is still loitering and drinking, can they please come and sit down, preferably at the front. Loiterers, make your way forward to a seat. Some seats at the front here. Okay, I think we have most people seated now. Okay, so hello and welcome to our forum where we aim to see trees and their wood and the impact our love for these is having on our world. Firstly, we are gathered here on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to all their elders past and present and their ancient wisdom that has looked after this beautiful land for so long and so well, and honour their integrity in fighting for the future of our land and theirs together. Also, a big thanks to the Institute, who has been overwhelmingly positive about the suggestion to hold this forum, and Australian Architects Declare for backing it, and the Sustainable Living Festival. So my name is Kat McLeod, and I'm co-director of architecture firm Belemo and Cat, and a sometime climate activist. After a long evening in the forest, so it seems to have stopped again. I seem to have a tech issue which is not solving itself. Any tech person want to come and help and work out why this is not going forwards? Sorry, people. I might have to stop the share and start again. Is that right? It's option. Oh no, there it is. It just moved on. Which one? Okay, great. Okay, excellent. Okay, tricky little button in the corner. Sorry, people. Okay, so the genesis for this conversation was spending a long night, and I mean a long night, from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. in the forest surveying for greater gliders, and that fluffy thing you see on the screen there, that's a greater glider. I'd never met a greater glider in any shape or form before I went into a forest about 5 years ago. I'd never even seen a postcard of it. And I was really dumbstruck that this amazing animal had completely escaped my attention and everybody's attention. And I guess it leaves 40 metres up in the forest in the dark. So how was I going to see it? Yep, hard. But anyway, after this amazing evening of walking in the forest and seeing these animals and this beautiful forest, I went back to my office and, as I say, I work in an architecture office, and just sort of had a flick through all our past specs and just sort of saw the predominance of hardwoods in our specs, just standard specs, and realised that, oh my goodness, that's that tree that glider was living in. And then I did some Googling, and I looked at various different websites and rang people, and I sort of kept coming up with more and more questions. So I just came up with questions about where is the timber that I'm using growing that's sort of randomly getting into my specs, just, door architraves and skirting boards, and what is a sustainable alternative? I seem to find many websites promising sustainable alternatives, but then when I rang and drilled down into it, I seemed to be ending up back in the native forest which I was walking in. And I was kind of questioning, how can it be sustainable to be taking the timber away from these animals and their homes? So the more I realised that, these are, the forests, and these are the forest after it's been sustainably managed and logged. So, I was like, well, I can't just do this. Just standing on the street and activism isn't going to help. This is really an issue for my industry. So, this was industry-wide issue, and perhaps this was time to actually take the activism into the industry. So I called various people, the people that you see here. I called Sue McKinnon, who's a conservationist and president of the Kinglake Friends of the Forest. Kinglake Friends of the Forest is a not-for-profit environmental organisation that aims to raise awareness about the native forests of the Central Highlands of Victoria and advocate for their preservation. In 2022, KKF won a Supreme Court case against Vic Forests, which determined that Vic Forests have been carrying out widespread illegal logging over their Central Highlands. Then I called on Chris Taylor over here to talk about the impact of logging on the broader climate crisis and timber certification, which has seemed to be a real issue for me. I kept coming back to, timber that had been PEFC labelled and certified, AFS, responsible wood, good wood, FSC. I was like, what is the difference between all of these? So I asked Chris to talk about this. He's a research fellow at the Fenner School of Environment and Society, Australian National University, and Chris specialises in spatial analysis of forest systems, disturbance regimes, remote sensing, environmental modelling, land use, forest certification, and many other things. A lot of data you see is actually made by Chris. So here's the actual genesis of a lot of the data. Then I bothered Paul Ha because of his involvement in Series Fairwood, and I use his Mullen Creek Timber Guide. He's an architect that has developed a keen interest and expertise in trees, wood and architecture, and was the instigator of Series Fairwood. Then, realising it would be good to speak to somebody who's a sustainable forester, I asked whether there was one and found, was recommended Australian Sustainable Timbers, and spoke to James and Annabelle, and so they're on this call and they will talk about harvesting native forest timbers on private land. And then finally, I spoke to a young chap called Darcy Vermont, who works for Julia's on-site timber milling, who works in recovery urban salvaging, and is capable of bringing the mill to your site and rescuing any trees bound for removal. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to the, that's the photos of all those people I've been talking about. I'll now hand over to Sue McKinnon. We can actually touch that one. We can touch that little, and then it stops.
I'm in the right spot here. So thanks for coming tonight. Thanks for your interest. As architects, you'll be specifying timber in your houses. It's likely this timber is coming from native forest logging. I'm here to discuss native forest logging and its consequences. Here's a beautiful piece of timber that we can use for floorboards, stairs, window frames and enjoy for years. But what is the real cost of this? Who pays the price? Native forest logging occurs in state forests of Victoria, including forests near me in Kinglake. The community group that I'm in, Kinglake Friends of the Forest, has recently won a court case in the Supreme Court of Victoria against Vic Forests. This win confirmed that wood sourced from native forest logging has been illegally logged and provides evidence that it cannot be called sustainable. The logging is carried out by Vic Forests. It's a wholly state government-owned authority. It logs native forest over most of Victoria, but the main areas logged are east of the Hume. These areas are the traditional custodianship of the Tungarong, Gunai Kurnai, Wurundjeri and Bidwell peoples. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that custodianship of this land was never ceded. Most logging in the east is in the Central Highlands. That's from Bunyip State Forest in the south to Nujee, south of Nujee, to Eildon in the north, and from Wallen or Wandong on the Hume Highway in the west to Bor Bor in the east. There's also a lot of logging in East Gippsland and Gippsland. The ecosystems logged are mountain ash forests, alpine ash and shining gum forests, and mixed eucalypt species forests. Both of those are to be logged. Adjacent to this forest is an area that was logged in 2019. That's 2 years after logging. Here's some ancient forest that went through fire as part of its life cycle in 1939. And that's what it looks like after logging. This is in the Rubicon. A year later, all that waste that's left on the ground is burnt in an inferno. The forest resource is given to Vic Forests for free. They extract mature forest areas stand by stand. Consider the foreground and the background of this photo. This is state forest in Rubicon. I could show you a picture like this of any forest in the east. Consider carbon. Mountain ash forest is the most carbon dense of any terrestrial forest measured in the world. The carbon story in native forest logging is very different to that of plantation logging. Mountain ash forest can carry up to 1,900 tonnes of carbon per hectare. Compare that to the Amazon, which typically holds 250 tonnes of carbon per hectare. In plantation logging, sawlog plantation logging at least, we start off with close to zero carbon in a cleared paddock. We grow trees and draw down carbon as we do this, then very efficiently convert those trees to wood products, which keep the carbon stored for another 30 to 90 years. The second round of planting and sawlog milling is completed before the timber of the first round decomposes. Compare this with native forest logging. Firstly, it's very inefficient, with incredibly high percentage wasted. And secondly, very little of the product ends up as long-lived products, the output. 60% of the forest that's cut down remains on the forest floor as waste and is later burnt. That smoke immediately going to emissions. Most of what is taken off the mountain ends up as paper and cardboard. Only 4% ends up as timber. So even a small quantity of lovely native forest timber represents vast swathes of forest destroyed. And when we talk about forest destroyed, we don't just mean trees. Wildlife also dies when the forest is destroyed. Greater gliders are one of those species that live in the tall forests of Victoria. Their population has gone from regarded as common, through being listed as vulnerable, to endangered in just 6 years. Research was released in 2016 showed that their population had crashed by 80% in just 20 years up to that date. And that was before the 1920 fires, in which they lost 30% of their entire habitat. They are in serious trouble. They're also ridiculously cute animals. Sometimes a picture of them looks like a soft toy stuck up in a tree. They're about the size of a very fluffy cat. They're curious and seem to be totally fearless of us. They're like a koala in that they just eat eucalypt leaves. These leaves are full of toxins. So like koalas, they can only eat so much before they have to just sit and wait for their bodies to detoxify the leaves. This is why they're particular about their food. They have to find trees that are mature enough to be consistently producing new growth of high nutrition. Most of the energy they consume is spent on detoxification. They live on the edge, nutritionally speaking. There are pure white ones, grey and white ones, like what you see here, and the ones we see more often, the black and white ones. Their superpower is being able to glide up to 80 metres between trees. They do this by extending the membrane between their back feet and their front elbows. Here's a nice house. They sleep during the day in large hollows called dens. They each require 20 dens within their home range of between 2 and 4 hectares. They're vulnerable to heat stress. When listing them as threatened with extinction, the Victorian Government Scientific Advisory Committee said of logging, gliders usually die if most of their home range is intensively logged or cleared. And although all animals may not die from the initial impact, they will die shortly afterwards. This is due to life history traits, affinity with home range, small home ranges, attachment to hollow-bearing trees they use for denning, and their specialist diet. Gliders are a flagship species. When we're losing gliders from habitat loss, this heralds the loss of many species that have similar habitat requirements. Australia leads the world in mammal extinctions. It's not hard to see why. We spend a lot of time in the forest at night, as Katie said, crashing through kilometres of forest scheduled for logging to locate and record greater gliders and yellow-bellied gliders. How do I play it? This is how we prove the location of a glider. And that's it. And then we get the location of the tree that the glider was in. After that, oops, not that one. We produce a map that shows where all the gliders are and provide videos also to the Department of Environment, and who pass it straight on to Vic Forests. They first verify them, then pass them on to Vic Forests. This one here, this detection. So even after logging commences, we have worked without success to save gliders. This was a pretty heart-wrenching one. It was a white morph, so we don't often see white gliders, and it seemed to be just looking into the home range that had been logged that day. Of course, Vic Forest was told immediately about this. There were emails to the minister, there were videos on social media. It even got involved in a court case and we lost, and that tree that you see the glider in is no longer there. So this is a logging map. This is what Vic Forest produced. The purple pink area is the area to be logged. They mark on it the gliders locations of the gliders that have been detected, usually by citizen scientists, sometimes by the Department of Environment. I've just put a yellow circle around each of the detections that they have marked on their map. And you can see those detections are in the pink purple area to be logged. They fully intend to log the areas where gliders have been detected, the tree they're detected in, and their home range. They intend to do so, and they do so. There's the aerial map afterwards. Before our court case, gliders did not get any special treatment. If they're located in an area to be logged, bad luck to them. This intentional removal of habitat is widespread. In the wildlife of the Central Highlands versus Vic Forest case, which is still ongoing, the Vic Forest manager of environmental performance was asked to consider the Department of Environment's habitat modelling. He deposed that if Vic Forests were restrained from harvesting in coops likely to contain at least one of the 3 threatened species in the watch case or their habitat, it would shut down all of Vic Forest operations in the Central. So our court case. The point of our court case was that Vic Forest was not looking for greater gliders or yellow-bellied gliders before they logged, and they weren't protecting them from death even when they had been advised of the detections. Before our case, though, there was another legal case against Vic Forest. In May 2020, the decision was handed down in the Friends of Leadbeater versus Vic Forest case. This was heard in the federal court. The federal court has no jurisdiction over Victorian state laws. The case was heard in the federal court for other reasons. But the decision remains. Vic Forest, the federal court judge found Vic Forest was in breach of many clauses in the Victorian logging laws. And this includes clause 2.2.2.2, which is the precautionary principle. Despite this finding, the state government regulator allowed Vic Forest to continue logging with no change of practice. We asked the regulator to intervene, but they refused, so we took the matter to court ourselves. We used 2 clauses in the logging laws and 1 or both. So one clause we used was what I just mentioned, 2.2.2.2, the precautionary principle, or PP. Friends of Leadbeater Possum showed Vic Forest had been breaching several clauses, including the precautionary principle. Another state court case, Warburton Environment versus Vic Forest, found that Vic Forest was in breach of the precautionary principle. Our case and Environment East Gippsland case found that Vic Forest was also in breach of this PP. Our case also found that Vic Forest was in breach of clause 2.2.2.4, which says that they must look for gliders before they log. So the result is that Vic Forest has been logging illegally over the entire of the Central Highlands and East Gippsland. Rio, so this is a really messy slide, apologies. In 1992, there was the Earth Summit in Rio, a global conference on environment and development. This summit concluded with a declaration on environment and development, which incorporated fundamental principles of sustainable development. The precautionary principle that I've just been talking about was one of those fundamental principles. The precautionary principle means that if there are threats of serious or irreversible environmental damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing measures to prevent environmental degradation. Australia signed the Rio Declaration along with 175 other nations. So compliance with the PP is one of the fundamental requirements of sustainable development, as agreed by the Australian government. Having signed the treaty, Australian states incorporated the PP into many of our laws, including the Victorian logging laws and the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. Since then, sustainable development means not only being able to continue at a certain rate, but also not threatening serious or irreversible harm to the environment. In law, the threat must be real. It must have scientific basis and be the subject of direct evidence by expert witnesses. The remedy must be proportionate to the threat. The precautionary principle is not directed to the avoidance of all risks, but dependent on the seriousness of the threat and the degree of uncertainty. Accreditation. Vic Forest has been repeatedly found in court to be in breach of the PP, the precautionary principle. Yet the Victorian government and Vic Forest call their forest management and their product sustainable. This is clearly misleading, to say the least. With this evidence of non-sustainability proven in court, your professional liability as architects may be at risk if you pass on such labels to consumers. After all of these court findings of illegal practice and proof of non-sustainability, Vic Forest still has PEFC accreditation. So if you have PEFC accredited wood, it can be illegally logged and it can be wood that has been unsustainably sourced. Forest Stewardship Council, on the other hand, have rejected 3 attempts by Vic Forest to gain their accreditation. FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, assessed Vic Forest practice as unsustainable even before they started losing court cases. So take care with what you recommend. One day, will beautiful stairs and blonde floorboards made from timber extracted from native forest be viewed with the same discomfort and even distaste with which we view beautiful old ivory objects now?
Thank you, Sue, for that beautiful and very passionate and driven presentation. Provides a lot of food for thought, and Paul Ha will now take the stand.
Just got to get a little bit organised here because I haven't got those smarts Sue had with me.
Yep. Hang on.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Kat, for instigating and organising and inviting me along to this conversation, which, as you say, it needs to happen. For as long as I can remember, I've loved trees. But it comes to
It's a bit laggy, that's all.
that much of the timber we use these days, and it's sourced through global opaque supply chains in ways that contribute to the I support our Victorian Labor government's call for an end to timber harvesting in the Central Highlands and other native forests by 20. The problem, as I understand it, is not the practice.
Hi, we can't hear through Zoom. It's quite quiet.
It's still on.
Yeah, they're saying you can't hear you through Zoom. It's a bit quiet.
Is that better?
If you move closer.
Yes, the problem, as I understand it, it's not the practice of harvesting per se, even as Clearfield, but rather it's the pace and the sheer scale and the intensity of it as it's occurring.
We still can't quite hear.
You can't hear. Oh, the microphone's in the back. So you have to turn the microphone to the laptop.
I think I'm getting it. Oh, is it? Oh, is the mic here, is it? Ah, sorry, got it. Thank you. Yeah, so look, yeah, the problem, as I understand it, it's not the practice of harvesting per se, even as Clearfell, but rather the pace, the sheer scale and the intensity of it as it's occurring for the most not only here, but across the planet. We need to press the reset button. I'm also troubled by claims made that wood is the ultimate building material in this now carbon-constrained world because it sequesters atmospheric CO2. That argument disregards the debt in forest carbon stock that's incurred through broad-scale harvesting, and that's a debt that dwarfs any resultant carbon stored in our builds, as Sue's illustrated with that flow diagram. It's a carbon debt that subsequent forest regrowth struggles to pay back when stressed by climate change, as well as silvicultural neglect or neglect of forest management. So think Black Summer. It's a debt that'll take much longer to pay back than we have time for in this climate emergency, which, if you believe the science, gives us somewhere between 0 and 40 years to effect deep carbon drawdown and then avoid civilisational collapse. In architectural speak, it's a carbon footprint that's not factored into environmental product declarations or EPDs that we use for Australian wood products, which then has us stuffing as much so touted carbon positive wood into our projects in the chase for carbon neutral life cycle status. That said, it's crucial that we don't lock up our forests. For us and our politicians, that's just a free pass for further ecological neglect. We desperately and we urgently need to see quite transformative change to native forest management that first and foremost makes these precious landscapes and their exquisite biodiversity healthier and much better able to survive the accelerating threats of global heating. Now that's going to involve assisting the advance of bigger, healthier and more fire resilient trees in less congested, more carbon and biologically rich forest landscapes. As this country had under 60,000 years of delicate stewardship before we took over. We need to be taught cultural burning by our First Nations peoples, instead of continuing with hot fuel reduction burning. And we should look more to smart and ecologically sensitive thinning of young, congested, fire-prone plantations and native forest regrowth, which, emerging from this intense logging or frequent wildfire, struggle to thrive and grow tall. So on the left is what we tend to get these days in young regrowth in native forest. On the right is what we once had and what we really want again. It requires sensitive, long-haul stewardship for enduring forest resilience that can yield some small diameter logs for building industry. And they're logs that are currently relegated to pulp and to paper production. Such regenerative silviculture can be guided by our First Nations knowledge keepers and other fresh-thinking forest scientists unaligned to commercial interests. It can mobilise rural Australians in local community-based forest stewardship, and it can be supported commercially by an ecologically committed cohort of timber specifiers, and that's you guys. Unfortunately, I won't have time here to elaborate on some of these ecologically and socially regenerative native forest management techniques, but I'm sure that James, who's with us online, will. This YouTube on my website, under Things to Share and Trees, Wood and Architecture, talks to a few of these methods a little more. And it points you also to other great people who live and breathe this stuff. Now, forests in the Central Highlands currently yield around 70% of all PEFC certified and non-certified construction hardwood that comes out of Victoria. So all the Vic ash that we love to specify, being mountain ash, alpine ash, shining gum, those kind of species. So where on earth, you may well ask, should we get our beautiful blonde hardwoods from when government decree in 2030 has them no longer available to us? Or if we want to act earlier on the advice of Sue. Whilst waiting on timber procured from native forest management that's undergone transformative change in the interests of our fragile planet, I think we've got 3 other responsible design and specification strategies at our disposal. First up, and most emphatically, I'd suggest we build small and lean with wood, tending delicately to constructed environments that we already have. So looking to quality over quantity, drawing on design creativity and fine craftsmanship, enterprise that's not going to cost the earth. Secondly, where we can, let's use timber recycled from a prior construction use. And let's look to wood salvaged to its highest and best use from native and exotic trees that have died outside of our natural forests, or whether we agree with it or not, they're deemed unsafe or in the way of progress. The resource here is fragmented, but it's really vast in aggregate. So it's best suited to webs of small local enterprise. And I know Darcy will speak about this opportunity lots more. Finally, by preferencing timber that's sourced locally, sourcing timber that's sourced locally from fast-growing plantations will hopefully incentivise Victorian farmers to plant and smartly manage out more trees for nature conservation and for high-value soil production on what are vast acreages of bare land they've found to be unsuitable for other agricultural use. Now, other than from these mostly currently small agroforestry enterprises and the micro sawmills that serve them, there's virtually no hardwood currently available from Victorian plantations, nor is there likely to be much of it in the next 30 years. So if you see on the bottom on the left there, it's suggesting plantation hardwood, sawlog, and where we're at with that, and you can see a tiny slither of orange if you've got good eyes at the moment, and then after 2030 there'll be no more of that, and you'll see the native forest harvesting has dropped off because that's the assumption that this study that was done for the government takes. Now in New South Wales and Tasmania, things are a little bit better, but still quite dismal. HVP, by far the largest plantation manager in Victoria, currently has no intention of planting more hardwoods, be it for timber or for pulp. And if you consider the fault lines in local resource security that COVID laid bare, I do find this really neglectful and short-sighted. About 9 years back, for the Mullen Creek Eco-Housing Project in outer suburban Don Vale, we were able to place covenants on the purchase of lots. And they included a requirement that timber products used on the estate be selected according to quite strict environmental criteria. Essentially, that they be either recycled from a prior construction use, harvested from trees grown in Australia or New Zealand under FSC certified forest management, or otherwise considered by us as responsibly sourced, so included on the Mullen Creek approved timber products list. And we also imposed an EO limit on formaldehyde emissions for engineered wood products and a ban on CCA treated wood. In applying this requirement, we were mindful that it wouldn't be easy for designers and builders and engineers. For example, other than through one small operation up in central New South Wales, which James will speak about, there was then, and there still is, no hardwood available that's grown anywhere in Australia with FSC chain of custody. Thankfully, some of what you're going to find at your Bunnings timber yard does satisfy Mullum Creek's timber selection criteria. Sorry, Rafi. Yeah. So, for example, locally fast-grown FSC certified radiata pine that's processed to framing and decking wood, structural plywood, particle board and MDF. So the framing pine on the left from Australia, fast-grown, but not the one on the right that's equally available at Bunnings, which is coming from the other side of the planet, very slow growing in quite in northern boreal forests. To capture what satisfied these selection criteria, we prepared timber products guides and related notes to help steer prospective residents and their busy architects and the engineers and the builders in the right direction. These guides and notes are regularly updated and they're freely accessed on the Mullum Creek and my own website. They schedule product by type and by application, listing manufacturers and suggesting retailers for each. Because they were prepared for folk active at Mullum Creek, they have a Victorian bias, but they circulate widely these days also interstate. Then, buoyed by the timber initiative at Mullum Creek, it seemed like a good idea to launch a social enterprise, Ceres Fair Wood, that's located in Preston, through Ceres Community Environment Park, that's based in Brunswick. I suspect a number of you will know Ceres and its vast and impressive work over 40 years now, teaching and celebrating environmentally sensitive living. Fairwood's mission is to connect small local tree farmers and sawmillers directly to an environmentally conscious market demographic in Melbourne that really values what they have on offer. So Fairwood acts as aggregator, fair trader and educator. High quality timber products supplied within short, local, transparent, environmentally responsible and community supported not-for-profit supply chains, much the same as Ceres Fair Food. So more like a farmer's market than a Coles or Woolies. As well as exterior grade plantation sugar gum, salvage macrocarpa timbers from small sawmillers Rob Horner and Joe Bell, and plantation southern blue gum, all cladding from Frank Hurst's farm in South Gippsland. Fairwood has southern blue gum and shining gum flooring from John Woodley's farm at Taggart, shining gum wall lining from John Lord in Tasmania's Western Tiers, an impressive range of Australian and exotic joinery timbers, many from Urban Selvage, and a swag of other quality woods, all recycled from Urban Selvage or farm plantations. The Fairwood website is as much an educational resource as a sales platform. Every product on offer comes with a story about the grower and or the sawmiller. And like Ceres Fair Food, Fairwood provides meaningful employment for asylum seekers in the warehouse, on the road, and with the in-house Reeboks carpentry team. And whilst it's growing from strength to strength, Fairwood will always be small and local. But good wood networks like this, they can be replicated many times over across our country. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have the time here to run through climate and nature-sensitive timber design and product selections application by application for your builds. On my website, there are plenty guides and YouTubes to help you with that. So in the minutes I've got left, I'd like to share with you a few of my more general hopes on how our working with wood might shift in this emergency. As part of our challenge to build light and lean, I'd suggest we be as sceptical as we are smitten with cross-laminated timber construction. For medium rise, say between 5 and 15 stories in height, CLT from local fast-grown plantation wood can make for a carbon-friendly and material-efficient structural system. But for low and high rise, where it also seems to be the rage, CLT is likely to be wasteful of precious wood resource. And I'll try to explain that a bit better. Here's a 2-storey house built in Tassie with essentially 2 homes worth of wood in it. So one house worth is in the CLT. Unfortunately, it's of European spruce. Another is in stick framing, also looks to be of that slow-growing spruce, and that sits alongside the CLT to provide the necessary cavities for thermal insulation and for running services. If only the upper floor joists and the roof rafters were beefed up just a whisker, there'd be no structural and no thermal purpose to the CLT whatsoever. Sydney's 40-storey Atlassian headquarters, that's going to be a hybrid timber tower with heavily reinforced concrete core, a steel exoskeleton, extra thick and heavily reinforced concrete floor plates at 4-storey intervals, and 3-storey, so effectively low-rise inserts of CLT, again European spruce, in between these concrete plates. In both these cases, I would have liked to see the project architects and engineers adopt simpler, much leaner and more affordable stick frame and or cassette timber construction. So was it about fashion, or maybe that quest for embodied emissions reduction, guided by those EPDs that disregard the overwhelming biological carbon debt attached to the procurement of wood from cold northern boreal forests in this case, in the limited time frame that we've got left to act impactfully on this climate crisis. Another thought, these potential future supplies of young, small diameter logs that I flagged earlier, they can be processed equally via small local enterprise. So they can be sawn into small section wood, ready for finger jointing and glue laminating. So something like Cusp in Wynyard, Tasmania, and Australian Sustainable Hardwoods in Hayfield, Victoria, are doing with 23 to 28-year-old Tasmanian plantation shining gum that was previously destined for pulp. It grows really fast. Or by rotary peeling on spindleless lathes for layup of laminated veneer lumber, or LVL, which Radcon at Yarram in South Gippsland is set to trial, with thinnings from its own hardwood plantations that are some way off being ready for harvest. The top of the right-hand side of your screen there, those end-match floorboards, they're made in Germany using European beech from slow-grown, natural and or semi-natural European forests. We can do that here too with our own fast-grown plantation hardwoods of a young age. We can even crush and reform wood fibre from small logs into rectangular section. It's a technology that was developed by the CSIRO in the mid-1980s, and then, like so many other innovations funded by our taxes, it was sold for a song to the Americans for onward commercialisation. We called it scrimber, and they call it parallel strand lumber. And of course, biophilic design, that begs for slim, round pole or whole tree structures, so there's not much wood waste here. Because necessity is the mother of invention, I trust we'll soon see wood products such as these, together with new materials from other super fast-grown, non-wood plant fibre in our finest architecture. Now, our job is to preference and celebrate these products that affect much lesser forest carbon debt and other ecological burdens on our young'uns, and on the natural world that'll otherwise really struggle to sustain them. And finally, I'd like to see us end these relentless forest wars that'll bear no winners in this emergency. Instead, to come together with a can-do spirit, freely and feverishly sharing our smarts and passions across all camps and disciplines towards building community and re-loving the earth. That's a serious motto. Urgently collaborating to trial new and better ways forward with our trees, our wood and our architecture. Established in 2021, the Gippsland Forest Dialogue is an awesome step in that direction. So thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Paul Hart. Lots of food for thought there, and yeah, you can all look up the Mullum Creek Guide, and yeah, I think there'll be lots of people out there with their calculators doing some calculations there. So we now have to talk Dr. Chris Taylor. Can you move this? Make that smaller. Move this over here. Should we move this thing? I can't move that. Okay.
Thanks, Kat. What I'm going to talk about tonight is looking at the forest ecosystem of the Central Highlands in Victoria here, and just an overview of what's happened over the past several decades and the crisis that it's currently facing. So one of the things that I'd like to start off with is just acknowledge that we're talking about forests on the land of Bunurong, Wurundjeri, Taungurung and Gunai Kurnai and Bidwell to the east. So I'd like to acknowledge their people and their elders past and present. So in this map that you see here, the areas in red are areas that have been allocated where logging is permitted, and you've got green areas which are conservation reserves, and you've got informal protected areas along with cleared areas which are mostly used for agriculture and different other farming practices, and of course urban areas. So one of the things I'd like to just launch into is frame this within a forest certification context. We have two forest certification schemes in operation. We've got the Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC, and the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification, which is the PEFC. The FSC was founded in 1993. It enjoys a broad stakeholder involvement. So you had environment groups, social, Indigenous, union groups and industry groups coming together to formulate a standard upon which they agreed was an acceptable forest management standard. Following that, the industry and government supporting those industries established their own more sort of industry-centric schemes, which eventually became under the umbrella of the PEFC. So with that in mind, there's been a lot of debate about the comparability of these schemes. Some say the FSC is better, others say that they're equivalent and so forth. So one of the things I like to launch into is an on-the-ground assessment, I guess, using what's happening in Victoria to actually show that there is actually a difference, and it's quite a pronounced one at that. So if we look at what's happening in Victoria, first of all, one of the things that I'd like to acknowledge is I work alongside with Professor David Lindemeyer, who's a world-leading ecologist, and he's been studying these forests now as of this year for 40 years. So I think if I'm correct, that is the world's longest continuing forest monitoring project. So the expertise that has been generated there, and he's published hundreds of papers, he's written many books on this particular topic, so it is an honour to work with him. And so I've been doing some disturbance analysis work with him. And so if we look at here, we've got different forest types. So more often than not, we hear this sort of claim that there's only a small amount of the forest logged. However, there are different forest types. Up in the northwest of Victoria, you've got the mallee, which is where we've got a large percentage of that forest ecosystem in the reserve system, about 85%. But where we've got the wetter forest, which is a much smaller area, that is where the logging is concentrated. So in the image where you see those little red dots, that's where the logging is concentrated. And it's primarily focusing on the wet forest types, which is what the mountain ash, alpine ash and shining gum forests are within. Now, when we assess the value of these forests in terms of what they provide to various animals like the greater glider, leadbeater's possum and all that, I did this analysis with David where we looked at 70 forest-dependent species and we prioritised them using zonation, which is a spatial prioritisation algorithm. And what we find is, like for species like the greater glider, like the leadbeater's possum, yellow-bellied glider, and so forth, we find that those areas of wet forest are actually higher in terms of their value, in terms of for habitat and for their persistence. Whereas if you look up in the Mallee, it's much, much lower. So when we look at the value of various land tenure, you can see here the third from the left where logging is permitted, we're actually seeing that that is ranking the highest in terms of value for those suite of species. And that's important. And so when we look at the individual, what's been happening on that land tenure, where we look at where logging is permitted and where logging is proposed, we're looking at some of the highest value forest areas. And this has obviously come about through the court cases. This is why the courts are finding in favour of the plaintiffs in the terms of that these forests are actually valued for a suite of biodiversity values and that the logging is conflicting with those values. So when we look at mountain ash is defined by its iconic tall trees. The mountain ash, in fact, if I'm correct, I read a Guinness Book World Records count of the mountain ash. Tallest tree ever measured was a mountain ash at 132 metres. So they're defined by the iconic tall trees, but you've got a suite of other species in there like tree ferns and myrtle beech. Some of those tree species can live for many centuries. In fact, in the O'Shanassy catchment, I think there was a tree fern that was found to be 2,000 years of age. So it's not just the trees that make up the forest, it's also these very long-lived biological legacies that persist in the forest. A close cousin to the mountain ash is the alpine ash. They occur at a higher elevation. So when we look at the distribution of mountain ash and alpine ash, you can see that it's fairly spatially restricted. So it's really hugging those mountain areas where there's a high rainfall. And so if we look at the Central Highlands, which I've got outlined there, that is where pretty much the bulk of the state's logging has occurred. It's also where the bulk of mountain ash is. About 44% of Australia's mountain ash forest cover occurs in the Central Highlands alone. So when we look at the alpine ash and mountain ash forest there, we can see it there in relation to Melbourne, which is to the bottom left-hand corner there. When we look at the land tenure, roughly about just under 30% is falling within the formal reserve system. There's a smaller percentage in the informal reserve system, but you can see there's a large percentage there where logging is permitted. So when we talk of logging, we're talking about clearfell. They have recently done variable retention, but recent court case have actually determined that variable retention has the same impact as clearfell logging. And so that basically, particularly in the ash forest, involves the felling of all trees and the valued logs are removed and the slash is left on the ground. It's therefore, after that, it's usually burned by high intensity fire. It creates an ash bed like you see here, which more or less results in the forest going back just to the bare soil. And although there are claims that the trees are planted back, the legacies of clearfell logging can be felt and seen decades on. So on the left-hand side of the image is a forest that was clearfell logged in 1969, so 54 years ago. And you can see that there's an absence of old tree ferns and all that, and the tree ferns on the right, which would have covered that forest previously. Some of those tree ferns can be 200-300 years old. And so they've been lost from that site. So even decades on, even though you can see trees growing there, the structure of the forest, the composition of the forest can be very different. And so when we look at fire going through the forest, some of that we've actually found in mountain ash forests that fires have burnt with elevated fire severity because of that change in structure and composition. So when we look at the overall impact across the entire landscape, and this is important to take a note of, we published a paper in 2020, David and I, and we looked at the forest landscape. So here is a satellite image of the Rubicon area near the Cathedral Range in the sort of north or northeast of Marysville. So here you can see a patchwork of recently cut forests, and they're really logged heavily up in there. So what we do is that we map the spatial records of where the logging has occurred, but also there's been the impact of a fire. So in 2009, the Black Saturday fires heavily impacted the ash forests. And so there's that disturbance added on as well. So now, whilst the actual footprint of the severely disturbed areas might not necessarily encompass the majority of the landscape, you've got to think about it as joining areas. So there are areas that you might stand in an area of forest, but it might be like you walk 300 metres and you walk into a previously clear-felled area, or you might walk into a previously severely burnt forest area. So what we did is we mapped the severely disturbed areas, either through high severity fire, where fire has burnt through the trees and killed the trees, or it's been clear-fell logged, and the proximity to those disturbed areas. So when we look at the landscape as a whole, before we go that, so these areas are, let's say, 200 metres in between disturbed areas. They're compromised, like they're exposed to increased light, they're increased weed incursion. There can be things like wind throw. So these adjoining, or what they call edge effects, actually have a pronounced impact as well. So it's not just the site of the disturbance, it's also surrounding the disturbed area. So when we look at the landscape as a whole, this is what it looked like in 1999. So the red areas are areas of significant disturbance, mostly through clear-fell logging. We had the areas that were in close proximity, which are the yellow colours, and the blue areas are more than a kilometre from those significantly disturbed areas. So as we go to 2004, we can see it increase. Then the Black Saturday fire came through the landscape, so you can see that jump. But then the clear-fell logging continues. And so what we see here is this creep up. So in 1999, about 40% of the mountain ash and alpine ash forest area was either disturbed significantly or was within close proximity. Now it's pushing 70%. So the thing is, that means that there's only 30% of the forest ecosystem, which is now mostly in the national park and the closed water catchments. So if you turn on your tap, it's coming from those closed water catchments. That's pretty much what's left. And in fact, the old growth is so low, it's about 1 to 1.2% of the ecosystem. So this is one of the reasons why the IUCN has actually determined that the mountain ash forest ecosystem in particular is critically endangered. So when we look at all of what has happened here, we're also seeing more fires in the landscape. And David and I published a paper on this 2 years ago. And so what we're seeing is a huge fire input on top of the disturbance from logging. And some of these areas are burning up to 4 times in 20 years. Now, mountain ash and alpine ash need to be without fire for at least 20 to 25 years, because if they don't, they're not mature enough to produce seeds. So you'll get a local sterilisation of that site. And David has published papers on this where he calls this a landscape trap. That's basically from, the disturbance regime has shifted so much that once a forest is disturbed, it cannot recover and you lose that forest. And so we're seeing a statistically significant shift after 2000 of these very large fires burning across the landscape. So how does this tie back to certification? Well, the State Forest Agency, VicForest, has been audited under both the FSC and the AFS, or the PFC, Responsible Wood Scheme. And on about 3 occasions, VicForest have been unsuccessful in achieving FSC under the Full Forest Management Standard and the more loosely termed Controlled Wood Standard, which has lower requirements, but VicForest was unable to achieve certification under that standard. However, in 2007, VicForest were awarded the PFC Responsible Wood, or what was back then the AFS, and it's kept its certification all the way through, despite all of these things happening. So in essence, the FSC is picking up these environmental triggers, and that's what I'm speaking on specifically here. But for some reason, the AFS Responsible Wood PFC is not picking them up. And so So, and that's a major point of difference. And so one of the things that you could probably base this on, a couple of things. The FSC audits are generally more inclusive. You get invited as stakeholders, you participate in the audit, you submit your evidence and concerns, and the auditors evaluate. That doesn't happen with the PFC AFS audits necessarily. We actually did meet with the AFS auditors about 10 years ago, and they basically said they said to us that there was no obligation for them to actually discuss and have dialogue with us. So stakeholders, that would be Indigenous peoples, even though I wouldn't call Indigenous people stakeholders, they're traditional, they're sovereign owners. So I'll correct that. But if we've got, but they need to be engaged. There are environment groups, there are union groups, there's a whole suite of different people that are interested or affected by forest management operations. So the FSC has the capacity to capture that, whereas I've not seen a great deal of evidence over the years of the PFC responsible audit scheme capturing that. Then once you get into the minutiae of the standard, if you look at the FSC criteria, like the FSC language around outcomes is a lot stronger. The organisation shall protect rare species and their habitats. That's quite explicit, whereas the responsible wood scheme standard says the forest manager shall develop and implement effective strategies. So the focus is more on the effective strategy as opposed to the actual thing in the forest. So the thing is that without further access to the audits under the responsible wood scheme, it's hard to come to a conclusive finding on why Vic Forest has been allowed to keep its certification, whereas the FSC has constantly picked up non-conformances and therefore Vic Forest has not been able to achieve its certification. So one of the things I'd like to finish on is that with the state of these forests and I guess the crisis that they're currently facing, and I must state, those maps also tell a powerful story on why we're running out of wood. So mills are shutting down and people are blaming greenies and saying, oh, these pesky greenies are doing this. But I've spoken to a logging contractor and he basically said he left the industry because when he went to a resource meeting, the government could not tell him or show him on a map where all this wood that had been put aside for the leadbeater's possum was. And he just said, no, I've got $2 million worth of equipment. I don't want to be stranded with it. And he got out. But he's actually really angry because he was always told that there was this large area of forest in the landscape and he wanted to stay in the industry. So it's not just about the environment, it's about workers too. And so what I'd like to finish on as well is the protected area network is also very deficient. And we've just recently published a paper, David and I, looking at the effectiveness of the reserve system. So all the areas in dark grey are the existing reserve systems, but the areas in red are areas that are needed to prevent the collapse of various threatened species across the landscape. These areas need to be protected and need to be free from disturbance. So for the leadbeater's possum to avoid extinction, a population viability analysis found that about 170,000 hectares of habitat needs to be there. And at the moment, we're falling short of that. And every time the forest is logged, because there's so little forest left, that window, that gap is getting narrower and narrower and narrower. And the likelihood of that population collapsing is ever growing more. So we've provided these maps and they're sort of like, when we compare this to New South Wales has a very large connected reserve system around Sydney, whereas the one around Melbourne is small and fragmented. And this is one of the things that about a decade ago that various stakeholders launched in the Great Forest National Park Initiative. This initiative will need to be looked at because this is about 10 years old now, but the need to protect forests, and this is where I would say the Great Forest National Park Initiative is more relevant now than ever. There needs to be a serious look at on how we actually look at these landscapes and see how we can better allow them to persist into the future, not just for animals, but for also people as well, because these forests provide an enormous social benefit to people and their well-being. So I'd like to finish off on that note, and I'll hand over to the next person.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. There's always a lot of dense material in your presentations, and a lot of that incredibly fascinating map work, which you are the author of. It's quite impressive. And James is going to have the job of talking after you, and I welcome James Felton Taylor, who is in New South Wales. I'm sorry, I don't know whereabouts you are in New South Wales. I think somehow north than New South Wales, is that right?
That's right. Thanks, Kat. Yes, in Dungog, which is just an hour and a half north of Newcastle. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the Gringai, the elders past, present and future. But I'd also like to extend this out to all the other First Nations in this area here where we work. The other issue, I'll be talking as a director of AST, Australian Sustainable Timbers, this evening, not in my other capacity as a board director of FSC Australia, New Zealand. Secret squirrel, next.
Next, I'm just trying to work out the volume.
My wife and business partner, Annabelle Cato, established Australian Sustainable Timbers in the early 2000s. Next.
Okay.
Yeah. Whilst we're working with Greening Australia on a plantations project. So next, for us quickly here, Kat. Yep. So it wasn't an industrial plantation. Next. It was, however, a farm forestry, multi-species plantation on farms. However, it was integrated into the farming system. So we were looking to use locally growing species and collect the seed for these plantations locally as well. So whilst we were looking for the reference points of these, we were looking into the surrounding native forest. So, well, however, we weren't prepared for the level of forest degradation that we found. And it really surprised us. We come here looking to find the species that we should be planting, collect seed from beautiful, viable trees. And what we were faced with was really quite devastating. These areas of forest typically occur on the steeper slopes and on poorer soils of the farms. And the farmers were really ambivalent to these areas. They didn't value them very much. They didn't see there was much grazing in them. The only time they grazed them was when there was a drought on and they pushed them up into the hills. Sure, they got firewood and fencing product and some timber for building yards and these sorts of things. However, they saw them really as a problem. They're full of weeds, fire problems and feral animal problems. So the farmers, they saw themselves as graziers, not tree growers. There was no silviculture. So silviculture, this word's come up a bit this evening. Silvi is Latin for tree, and silviculture is the process or the act of growing trees for our values and our needs. Now, I think what probably is coming through to everyone by now is that we've been really good in forestry about supplying our needs, but not really addressing our values. And I think that is also coming through with where forestry is at this point, where suddenly it's having to grapple with values. So we realized that there was this really big lack of education and knowledge around how to grow trees, their language. I often use the analogy of Monty Python and the song about every sperm being sacred. We've almost come to the point now where we see every tree as being sacred. However, somewhere between those two, cut it down and let them all go is the path that we need to take. That's the silvicultural path. Next, please. So we formed the Hunter Farm Forestry Network. It's a small community-based group in the Hunter Valley here. It works with landholders and farmers and community members, gets them out in the forest. They talk to each other about the problems they're having growing trees on farms if they're trying to establish plantations, the problems they're having with weeds or feral animals in the native forest. And we started this process of education, of imbuing a process of silviculture. The other issue, and we've also teamed up with Master Tree Grower course, which is run out of the Otways down there in Victoria with Rowan Reid. Next one, thanks. So we saw the extent of the problem when we were walking around visiting these native forest areas on private land, seeing that they'd been neglected, that they'd been really used as an extractive industry, the forestry processes, opportunistic harvesting here and there. Maybe the local sawmiller will come and tap them on the shoulder and offer them some money for their timber if they allow them to do a harvest. And we began to see the scale of this degradation. And we suddenly realised that we'd found ourselves a project, a pretty daunting project, but a project nevertheless. So farmers like us are time poor, and they're not getting any younger. And the scale of the issue had become apparent. We realised that really we needed to turbocharge what we're trying to do here. Educating farmers was one thing, but we needed some sort of process to actually regenerate these forests on a large scale. So, next one, thanks. Okay. Can we go back one? So we bit the bullet and we set up a small sawmill in Munkery, New South Wales. And as you can see here from these logs, these are very small logs by industry standard. We're very fortunate in the areas here in the Hunter and the east coast of New South Wales that we've got some of the best timber species in the world. A lot of the class 1 durable species, so your decking, your cladding, and high impact flooring. So this is a little white mahogany log. You can see just how beautifully dense these timbers are. They're very small sapwood. These timbers are traditionally only used for fencing products. But these are the logs that the forest really needs to be removed. The regrowth forests grow back very, very thick, as you've seen some previous photos. And what the trees desperately need is they need for the competition to be released. The competition builds up, the trees stop growing, they become more vulnerable to drought, stress, fire, and other disease and pathogens. Next. Yep, So, however, sawmilling is a really difficult business, as is forestry. It's hard work, it's capital and labour intensive, and it takes a lot of sweat, blood and tears to get the timber that we all know and love. So after biting the bullet to set up the mill and do the hard work of extracting logs, and you can see in the background of this photo just how thick the forests are. In the background, you can probably see some spotted gum, I think predominantly there, white mahogany, a bit of iron bark. So then it became time to try and get into the marketplace and start marketing our timber. Next. However, our logs range in that 20 to 30 centimetre range. And here's a miller from up the north coast of New South Wales. He's actually talking to the Master Tree Grower group that Bell was taking around up there. And someone asked him the question, what's the perfect size mill log? And there he is there with his arms wide apart. That's his perfect mill log. You know, that tree is over 120 years old. And this is what we're up against when it comes to doing our forest regeneration. We're competing with mills that are getting perfect logs delivered to them. And you're probably starting to see a theme here. These logs are coming out of our forests and being dropped off at mills. So how do us as a small producer of timber, how do we get heard in this marketplace? Next. So we've all heard of greenwash, we've all seen it. We probably see it most days. Every forest manager, every timber outlet is telling you how good their product is, how sustainable they are, how they plant a tree for every tree they cut down. And how do we, operating, doing bush regeneration, forest regeneration type logging, how do we compete against these sort of operations? What's our point of difference? How do we get heard in this marketplace? Next. Can we go back a couple, hopefully? Okay. Yep, no, that's right. So, but as we know, forests are more than just about their timber. Forests also about the ecosystem services. Pure water, pure air. Next. Over 150 of our species of animals rely on hollows as part of their life cycle. So these are really important for us in our area, for yellow-bellied gliders, obviously our parrots, our birds, phascogales, antechinus, you name it, they live in hollows. And we need hollows, everything from the size of your little pinky all the way right up to, you know, enormous hollows the size of wheelie bins for powerful owls and things like this. Next. Okay, so then we came across this international company, this international organisation that was talking about values, not just timber. It had a unique and multi-party governance structure. It actually gave equal weighting to the social, the environmental, as well as the economic values and needs that the forests produce. It wasn't just lip service, but it was core to its functioning. The system was independently audited every year. It had a clear complaints and grievance process. Our timber, any timber, would be compared like for like, not just about who could do the best marketing, who could shout the loudest, or who had the biggest marketing budget. It had stakeholder engagement. First, we wondered, what is this? What is stakeholder engagement? It's actually all of us. All of us have an interest in how our timber is produced. We're actively encouraged to participate and comment in the certification and recertification of FSC certified companies. There's an audit trail for every stick of timber. This is the chain of custody. This ensures that substitution is removed from the system so that timber retailers aren't selling more certified timber than they're actually buying in at the other end. This is to give the consumers the certainty when it comes to specifying and using certified timber. Was it perfect? No. Was it robust? Yes. Next. Next. Oh, sorry, go back one. So this was the FSC process. And in the early 2000s, I think it was 2006 or around then, FSC was getting going in Australia and they held their first stakeholder meeting down in Lancefield, Victoria. And Bill and I, we went down for this meeting. We got to see the FSC process at work, this multi-stakeholder process, this multi-party governance structure. And what always came through was someone used the analogy of the three-legged stool. And without one of those legs being equal to all the rest, the stool falls over. And I think that's a great analogy around FSC. From where we've been now for the last 15 or so years, it's the processes of stakeholder engagement and that multi-party governance structure that really underpins the strength of FSC. Okay. So this is the FSC logo. This is our FSC logo with our FSC chain of custody and forest management number there, and you can look that up and check that we're valid. So what about PFC and responsible wood? I won't say too much because I think Chris has covered it a bit. However, FSC is a top-down high-performance standard. The three chambers of governance drive a transition beyond the status quo. Its 10 principles and 70 criteria coming down from the top actually ensure consistency around the world. So in this globalized supply chain, it doesn't actually matter where your timber comes from, you know it's been grown to the same standard. PFC, on the other hand, is an endorsement scheme that applies a bottom-up approach. It seems that responsible wood, like many other industry-based schemes, encourages the status quo. I probably don't need to comment too much on that. So what does it mean for us as a forest regeneration company? So because of our FSC certification, it means that people come and find us because we can't market hard enough to come and find you. So when you specify Australian Sustainable Timbers FSC certified timber, you're actually helping to keep the forest regeneration process alive. This is the cladding. Despite what Paul said about us being small, we actually produce a fair bit of timber and we've just upgraded to a new facility. So this is the cladding for the Sustainable Building Research Centre at the Wollongong University. So this is a living building challenge. And obviously we're great supporters of these types of institution. They really drive the process of sustainable timber procurement. Next. This is Sydney Waters, one of the Sydney Waters headquarters in Sydney, Parramatta, I believe. Once again, this was cladding. In this case, it was a mix of of white mahogany, tallow wood and sugar gum, all FSC certified. Next. And this is probably the job we're most proud of. This was the Marrickville Library redevelopment. So as you can see, this is a significant amount of wood. We supplied the wood for the veneer, the external batten system here, for the internal flooring and seating of some of the pavilion areas. So as specifiers, how can you help? So start the conversation early in your jobs, particularly with the bigger jobs, because bigger jobs require longer lead times. And remember, trees grow in colours other than blonde. So we've got so many beautiful timbers up here. We've got coastal red gum, grey gum, which is a delicious red colour, forest red gums. We've got Sydney blue gum. We've got an amazing suite of species, which with good design and a careful eye to detail, I think can be really well incorporated into your build. So don't forget that to help that regeneration process, to start, keep it moving, specify FSC Australian certified timbers. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a very beautiful presentation and really interesting to look at how FSC, the 3 schools, I think was a really great analogy for that certification scheme and its viability. Thank you. And now we're handing over to our last speaker, who is Darcy Vermont, who is an urban salvage miller. So he mills urban salvaged timber only. And thank you.
Hello. Yeah, I'm here to talk about the possibilities of sawmilling urban timber, which urban timber or other sourced timber that is managed because of our lifestyles, which could be councils or just other timbers that we live among. So this is me. I've been working milling for about 1.5 years. I grew up on a farm out in central Victoria. I'm a mechanical engineer, arborist and portable sawmill operator. So I'm often working the mill and doing machinery maintenance and fabricating things for our operation.
Hi, Darcy. We can't actually see you. If you want to move down just a little bit or put the computer screen back. There we go. Awesome. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I've been loving the milling because it aligns with my values of sustainability, and these trees are usually down for waste, so it captures that in the carbon forms. It's fun and I like hands-on work. So the problem currently is wastage, which is coming from places like arborists, roads, councils, storms and farms. a huge amount of timber is just docked up or chipped, and you can see here a big log over a road needs to be moved, but it could be dragged away for sawmilling, but it's not seen for that purpose. It's just seen as waste to get rid of. So our sawmill is a Lucas mill. It's a small portable mill. We've got about 4 mills. They pack on the back of a truck or a small trailer, depending on the size of the mill. The Lucas mill is one of the most commonly sold portable sawmills in the world. There's like maybe 20,000 of them out there in over 100 countries, and they're made here in Victoria out near Beechworth. They're so popular because they're made for our hardwoods and they can cut quite quickly. So we're the only on-site only portable sawmilling operation. A lot of people have mills on site and they drag logs to the mills, or they do little jobs here and there, but moving logs is quite hard or costly, particularly as you can see here with this big log. So that's the boss, Paul McKay. I work for a company, Julia's on-site timber milling. And he started that company maybe 6 years ago. And yeah, we can get quite huge logs that most people can't get. This is stuff that's fallen down near houses or is already being disposed of or wasted otherwise. In terms of compact and portable, we also get access to a lot of logs that can't be accessed any other way. The mill packs up into easy to carry pieces. We can carry it through the side gate. We've gone through someone's kitchen when they didn't even have a side gate, drag all the parts through, set it up in the backyard, often in towns, often in, yeah, just like front yards, backyards, just in the city areas around Melbourne and out of Melbourne. I'll flick through a couple pictures of just some work we've done. This is a Himalayan cedar up in the patch in the Dandenongs. All that timber there is now stacked and drying at Ceres Fairwood. We supply a lot of our timber to Ceres Fairwood. This is just an example of a bit of red gum milled into posts that is otherwise just an old trunk lying around. We're often making things for customers like these chairs. That sawn timber is red ironbark, so eucalyptus sideroxylon, but it was growing, leaning over a power line over their driveway and over their house. It was removed and we milled it, and they're building a big outside table with that now. We also work with councils, milling like these flat tops that go in parks and playgrounds. We mill steppers as well that get buried and put in. We work with Banyule Council, and they've got an architect that comes on site, sees our mill. That helps a lot. It's easier for everyone when the architects know what is easiest. So yeah, they can easily say, we want this sort of timber, and they know that we can provide that within what we can do. This is out past Dalesford. A farmer had come into possession of these trees just from a power line company removing some trees, milled all that timber for a shed. More timber, this was only a couple of weeks ago. I milled all that and then built the fence. That was a pretty satisfying job. That was from the storms 2 years ago on a farm. In the background of that trailer load of wood, you can see just logs everywhere. They'd fallen all over his road onto his sheds. They'd all been dragged off, and then we're milling them. This is a house. Pretty much everything you see in that house we milled. It's cypress, and yeah, that was about 24 cubes of timber. Took a couple of weeks, and we can timber grade it and stamp it. Oh, we're back. yeah, so we're a small operation and it feels pretty inefficient sometimes, but we're still competitive with prices from big sawmills. And I think largely because we don't cart logs and moving logs, and we're on site doing it directly with people. There is often roadblocks that we've come into with working with architects and builders and things. One example is that first picture of me on the log that was hollowed out. That was for a playground, and the playground builders, after we'd finished it, they said, oh no, it says on here it needs to be a round hollow log. So, well, this works better for us, and we think it looks better for kids because it's like a cubby house. We managed to get in touch with the landscape architect and sent them some pictures, and they said, oh, we love it, that's so much better. So there was this roadblock that they wanted to discard our work, when really it was just a chain of commands blocking what was the best path forward. Another case, we were delivering logs for garden edging. When we got there, there was a tree being removed. And we said, why don't you use that tree? We've just trucked all the branches across. They said, oh no, the arborist is just getting rid of that. So there's a problem with arborists. Once they've got the contract to remove the tree, that's their job, to just remove it. So they're not interested in fiddling around getting the pieces that could be used on site. Yet again, when they saw the branches that we brought, they said, oh, these are too small. And we said, no, this is exactly what you specified. Because they hadn't been on the ground seeing the size of the logs compared to what they said, 300 mil dimension, I didn't realize, oh no, we actually want bigger. So then we're trucking in more logs again. This is all just because of miscommunication and yeah, not much sort of forward planning. This is a good example of an urban tree that people would say, oh, there's not much timber in that. The bottom section has great straight timber in it. The top, the customer was like, oh yeah, just cut that up. And we said, no, we'll slab that for you. Slabbed it. And he built this whole area just for the whole bar section because he loved it so much. And that's just a great example of sort of just thinking outside of the box with a lot of timbers that can be used. This big table was milled on the 23rd of December and they wanted it for Christmas. So we got there, they kept calling up, pestering the boss, come and mill, come and mill. He said, all right, yeah, I'll come up. Milled it that night after milling it. Took a couple hours to mill. It was a Regnan's Mountain Ash. That night he was sanding it all. The next day it was assembled and ready for Christmas. And it was just the way that the joinery was done. It could be tightened up if there was shrinkage and yeah. So in terms of the capacity of trees, I'll use Melbourne as an example because they've got a good tree management inventory, which is publicly accessible online. They've got 80,000 trees registered or more than that. If roughly the average life of an urban tree is around 50 years, that sort of levels out to around 30 trees a week that will fall down or be removed, just as the urban forest sort of lives. And we know that the Melbourne Council themselves removed 1,200 due to safety issues or damage. The City of Greater Dandenong removed 2,000 a year. The City of Merribeck, 1,200. So if you extrapolate that over 30 or more councils in and around Melbourne, there's a lot of logs, there's a lot of timber, but most of them aren't usable. There's a lot of just small. So even if it was 5% of all the logs that are taken out in council land, that's still thousands of logs a year. And talking with arborists, this is my favorite question for any arborist out there in school or anything that I've been, is like, how many saw logs do you think are being docked up for firewood every week? And they're working in crews that usually would dock up multiple big logs near a metre diameter, 1 or 2 a day. They're just felling, knocking them out, docking them up on private land, or they're just contract arborists coming in doing this work. So yeah, I think these numbers are conservative, particularly because this is just in and around Melbourne. You've got the whole of Victoria. There's a lot of logs being wasted. So popular, things that we're working on or things that we'd hope to see in the future. My favourite is a timber history register, which individuals can decide for themselves about the ethics of the timber. We want to put a QR code on a bench like this, and that you scan it, at any time 20 years from now, and it'll show you the tree, the arborist report, why it was removed, us milling it, just all the details that we can keep uploading onto this site for each tree, and the QR codes will follow along in that product. So whenever anyone sees one around, they can scan it, say, oh, this is where it came from, this is why, or if it is to do with ethics or uncertainties, we just want 100% complete transparency so people can decide for themselves. If they don't like the reason that the arborist removed that tree, they don't have to buy that timber, or they can check for themselves if they prefer storm damage over road widening sort of things. So the tree registers with council is another opportunity to have knowledge of what trees councils might remove in the future. They've got tree maintenance programs, and they have work programs for those trees. So they know sort of future plans. So the councils also have highest and best use policy. More and more they're picking up this policy, which means that the trees have to or should be getting milled for timber as their highest and best use. So bringing those things together should result in councils supplying a lot of their timber for sawmilling. So it's basically, we're a small operation, but the boss is always talking about huge potential to expand. A log register for pickup or milling could just be that anyone who sees a tree down or has a tree down on their property, takes a picture, uploads it to a map, and then we've got an idea of where we can go. We might just say, oh, we'll pick up all these logs, take them to this mill, and then we'll go and mill these ones on site because they're too big or this and that. So yeah, that's our hopeful future direction. Yeah, in terms of timber and like the supply of timber from forestry, whatever's happening out there, for me, I think the best thing to be doing now is using the timber that's currently being wasted. There's just so much out there, and I think that can compete with a lot of the sawlog timber industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Darcy, for that last comment. That true, the timber that's lying around for waste can probably compete with what's going on in the sort of timber industry. Do we have any questions from the audience? I seem to have lost the Zoom audience somehow. Do we have anybody that's got a question here? Yeah, I did see.
I can read out some of the questions from Zoom when they start coming through.
Okay. Okay. I think all the questions are, we can't hear Paul better, thanks. Can we ask you? We can only see his chest. Okay, very nice shirt. Okay, so good. We can ignore all those questions. Okay, so one of the questions that I was asked beforehand was going to be not about someone's shirt or chest, but was okay. Was about regrowth forest timbers. Is it okay to log these as they don't have the same ecological value as old growth timbers? And I noticed that Chris suggested that there was only 1.1, so there's only 1.1 something % of Victoria as old growth mountain ash list. Okay. So because I was going to say, well, then that means that there is no option of logging anything that's not regrowth. So that was the question. It's like regrowth forest. Is it okay to log these as they don't have the same ecological value as old growth forest? Probably over to you, Chris, straight away. It's probably, yeah, maybe if you've got an answer to the question, come up to the microphone. Yes, exactly. I think that's it.
The old growth term, and I don't know if I'm in view, I can't tell if it's here or here, but yeah, old growth is a specific growth age of the forest, and whilst there's been a lot of focus on them because they tend to have like a, they've got like this sort of public, they kind of signify something to the public. The bulk of biodiversity values are in forests of different age classes. So they'll be in 80-year-old forests, they'll be in 120-year-old forests, they'll be in a 200-year-old forests. And so, for leadbeater's possum, for instance, they're actually in multi-age forests. So you have young trees with old trees with some degree of disturbance from a previous fire, with wattles and so forth. So if you were just protecting old growth forests, you would be losing a whole suite of the landscape that support other species. And that's why we should not necessarily use the word old growth, because it's a very narrow way of valuing the forest. But we just should look at the broader suite of values, biodiverse native forests, for instance, because there are a lot of high conservation value forests. So for instance, the forests on the south base of Mount Bauble, some of you have heard of Mount Bauble, those sites have that area is a site of global zoological significance. It's not an old growth forest, but it has the critically endangered endemic bauble frog, the leadbeater's possum, smoky mouse, and the broad-toothed rat, all very niche species that it's very rare to find them all in one area. And it's not just the forest, it's the soil type. It's very wet there. The bauble frogs over decades have been protected from climate extremes. And so it's not just old growth forest that the forest is valued for. There are all these other values that really need to be taken into account. So the regrowth, I don't like the term regrowth forest because it's used to devalue the forest. Oh, it's regrowth, so it's okay that we sort of trade it off. I think we need to be a lot more inclusive and look at the forest more holistically.
Kat, can I come in there?
Yes, go, James.
Oh, Sue, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Thanks, James. Yeah, we had a bit of a dispute with Vic Forest, right? When we first started this, I knew a lot less about what was going on, and we went up to King Lake, and they were about to log an area of forest that clearly had trees from 1900. It was mountain grey gum and mesmate and peppermint. And on their logging plan, it said regrowth forest, regrowth from 1939 fires. And I didn't really understand the implication and the reason that they had those words on there. And we just said to them, 1939 fires did not come here. How can it be regrowth from 1939 fires? And they went, oh yeah, well, whatever. And they left that term on the logging plan, the logging map. And I realised later that what they want to do is tell the community that we only log regrowth forest, as if that's a good thing. It's not a good thing anyway. I mean, our regrowth is our future old growth. But that's the reason they wanted to have that term on their logging plan. And so when they say regrowth, they're not talking about areas that they logged 20 or 30 or 40 years ago and they're re-logging. They're talking about most of the forest that has been burnt. It's ancient forest that happens to have gone through its fire cycle in 1939. It still has all the biological legacy of ancient forest. It still has 200, 300-year-old ferns in it and lignotubers that are coming up. Carbon, much of the carbon remains after a fire. So it's almost a marketing term.
So the point that I would raise around regrowth, and I think it's sort of coming through here, is there is regrowth and there is regrowth. So the forests that we deal with here in New South Wales and on private land, they're typically very young regrowth forests. However, our approach is to say that these regrowth forests need to be managed in a proactive way back to being mixed age classes. But to do that, it is a long-term process, And under FSC, we've actually got to map out exactly how we're going to achieve that. So we're talking over management and harvesting processes that are laid out for decades into the future, because trees grow slowly. Good trees grow even slower. We don't clear fell here. We don't do post-harvest burns. So we're doing selective logging, and our aim is to actually thin out these areas of regrowth and to get them back into, hopefully, I'd like to think that it won't be me, but obviously, hopefully my children or my children's children will be looking at trees like the ones that I'm looking at here on the slide, 100, 150 years in the future. But benign neglect on our forests, they lock up. There is silvicultural regimes need to be put in place if we're going to give these forests the resilience to grow forward. There needs to be, if you think these forests are several hundred stems to the hectare, old growth forests in our area here are 20 to 40 trees to the hectare. So we need to be managing that process from several hundred, 700, 800 trees often, down to 20 to 40 trees. And this is a very long time frame. I'll leave it at that. I'll talk all day otherwise.
Yeah, there's one that says, how do we think we can build bridges and bring the timber industry along with us on the sustainable timber journey? What is our including architects transition journeys?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and it's probably something that's been lacking for a good while. Because, sorry? Oh, yeah, got you. Yeah, cheers. It's not as nice as Christmas. Anyway, because there's been this culture of, pitting people who log the forests with the people who are trying to save them. It's been this adversarial thing for so long. And I left the last slide on my presentation. I just mentioned the Gippsland forest dialogue. So that's just in these parts of Victoria where most of the timber trees come from. It's a really wonderful initiative, and Alistair, who's sitting just next to the column, was one of the initiators of that. And it's fantastic, and we're really trying to bring together people. And we have from industry, from environmental groups, around Goongerah, a number of smaller and larger sawmillers. What else? We've got lots of forest scientists from all over the place, particularly through Victoria and Melbourne Uni, and sort of community people who are important in their own community, just as business people in the Gippsland region. A whole range, a suite of people from all sides. And the thing is there that they can come together and without the fear of being attacked or that they would be listened to carefully, and they can really express very calmly and clearly their concerns, the potentials they see for Gippsland environmentally, socially and economically around the forests. And I'm just really quite taken by how sophisticated and how thoughtful that dialogue is. So I think we definitely can do that. And what's been happening in Gippsland with that dialogue, it was modelled on a thing called the Forest Dialogue. So you can Google the Forest Dialogue or the Gippsland Forest Dialogue and find out a bit more about those. The Gippsland Forest Dialogue website is a bit lean at the moment, but I was told just the other day it's going to have a lot more stuff in it, like a background paper we prepared, and then from our first dialogues, the kind of reports from those. And it's a really good model for building those bridges, like Carolyn's mentioned in her question. And I think it could be done in lots of other parts of the world as well. So.
I could just add a little bit on that.
Yeah.
How can we bring the timber industry along? I think if we did have these tree registers and councils on board, I'd love to see all the timber that's everywhere, just getting dragged off to all the local mills. I've talked to a few old sawmills, and they're just saying we can't get the logs, and then all around them there's logs. So there just needs to be some process of coordinating the logs that exist and getting them to the mills to use that as the feedstock, stuff that's already down and getting wasted.
That's an interesting. That's an interesting idea, Darcy. In that, in fact, what you're suggesting is there could be almost like a catalogue, a visually available catalogue of logs that people could, like us, could actually go on and go, oh look, there's a Sydney blue gum, there's a whole lot of cypress, there's oh my goodness, there's an oak tree, oh, I would like some oak stairs,
Yeah.
and actually
private companies might start up just crane trucks going, we'll drive around this map, we'll pick them all up, and then we'll go sell them to the mills. Any way that they can get there and get used. Yeah.
So how do we kickstart that industry, do you reckon? Some sort of website. Someone comes up with an app. Someone gets an app. QR. Logs will come next. Okay. So I had another question, which was that there are very few FSC certified timber suppliers of hardwood. I think it was that year was. But many PEFC. How do we create more FSC certified timber suppliers? Tough question. No answers. Go for it, Chris.
First of all, there has to be market incentives. So about a decade ago, the Green Building Council only awarded Green Star points for FSC or recycled wood. That initiated a supply chain. Now I was involved with this. I actually didn't get paid for it. I did it pro bono, but the wood veneer in the Melbourne Convention Centre was the first locally produced FSC certified wood veneer in Australia. And it was supplied the veneer was supplied from James and Annabelle's Forest veneer, and it was put onto an FSC certified substrate. Now, there was a big push for the Green Building Council to also endorse the PEFC as equivalent. And the Green Building Council eventually relented. It more or less conceded to that pressure, and it amended its Green Star rating to give equal status to both FSC and PEFC. So what does that mean? Well, what happened was that the Melbourne Convention Centre only happened because the Green Building Council was driving up the performance. And if you don't have those market incentives there, if you don't have those leading attributes in the marketplace, and they're being undermined, and the Victorian government at the time put out a policy saying that any organisation, any department that preferred one scheme over the other would have its funding withdrawn. So this was a very bad market signal, and it undermined, in my view, in my experience working on that project, in my view, it undermined that incentive. So the thing is, where we get leaders and people pushing the boundary and pushing the new ground, like governments have to be supportive of it. They can't be going out there and sabotaging.
If I could just come in at that point as well, as an FSC timber producer, it's about demand. Demand will drive this space. We've gone from a portable mill to a slide table mill, and we're in the process of our third upgrade, and that's demand driven. We're putting in a small log line very soon, because that's the logs that need to come out of the forest. They're the small logs. They need to come out to reduce that tree competition, as I've said before, to allow these forests to get growing. We need big trees. We need big trees fast, because we need those hollows to support the ecology that needs them. So I say it's by specifying FSC timber, that's the best way to drive that market.
Thank you, James. Is there any questions from the audience? Yeah.
So we do have some questions in the Zoom chat here as well.
Yeah.
In the Zoom Q&A.
Do you want to call them out? Oh, I can see them now.
Yeah, if you want to read them out so the audience can hear them as well. I'm sure the
Yep.
audience probably can't hear
Yep.
me right now.
We've got the one here. So, okay, so your question about plantation timbers and monocultures, is that correct? So you've seen some pretty horrific, we've got a great question from the audience. We've seen some pretty horrific monocultured plantations, which are like dead zones, is that right? And what can be done about that? Is that right? Great question. Okay, do the FSC certify those sort of timbers, and are they interested in stamping them out or qualifying whether that's viable? Yeah.
Can you read which? I'm looking on the Zoom link here to see which question. Sorry, which?
So if you go down to the bottom, there's a little button that says Q&A.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I'm on that one.
And then if you scroll down to open, there's a few people who have typed in.
Yeah, I've got down to 18 at the moment.
It's okay. We've got a question from the audience, and then we've got a few on the Q&A. Did you hear that, James?
So this has come up in the FSC with plantation management, and of recently, well, there were two particular cases, one recently and one about 10 years ago, where there were koalas inhabiting the plantation, and the plantation company was going in there and cutting them down, treating it just more or less like a wheat crop. And that got raised. It prompted quite a bit of reaction from the FSC, and that certificate was actually suspended, the one that happened 10 years ago. And the company involved needed to close out major corrective actions that were issued against it by the certifier to implement various measures to protect koalas that are found on their plantation areas. So that's one particular example. I'm not sure of the examples you're referring to. If I speak more broadly, the issue of FSC certifying plantations internationally has been a contentious issue over decades, and particularly in tropical countries where plantations were established on previously degraded land but displaced a lot of local people. And so FSC has undertaken a plantation review about 15 years ago. I'd probably recommend you check the website. I don't know the specific details of that, but it was a contentious issue. And one of the founders of the FSC, Simon Council, actually was very condemning of the certification of these plantations. So that prompted the FSC to conduct a review. It's a very broad issue, and I can't necessarily answer it in one sort of sound bite because globally, plantations, in fact, there's a push more for FSC. There's been a greater push for FSC to certify native forests over plantations, because plantations are more or less seen as industrial monocultures, whereas native forests or natural forests are seen to be more diverse and more. They provide a lot more to people around them. And but again, like that, I'm not saying that's my particular view. I'm just saying that's a concern that's been raised internationally over the last decade or two. So it would probably be an area to look up. There was a FSC will probably not like me say this, but there was a website set up called FSC Watch, which talked a lot about this. And you can also, and I encourage you to look at the FSC also to see how they've responded to those claims. But locally speaking, there has been contentious plantations that have been identified, and they've had their certificates suspended because they were in clear breach of the FSC principles and criteria, and they needed to actually correct those non-conformities before the certificate was reissued. In Victoria, we don't. In Victoria, particularly with native forests, we don't necessarily have, I guess, the area of native forests on private land like New South Wales has. And probably James is more qualified to speak about forestry in New South Wales than me. Oh. No, there's no reason why they couldn't at all. In fact, my colleague, David Lindemeyer, said that what James was doing, James and Annabelle were doing, it's kind of like a flagship of where we need to be looking towards. So my concern is that the more degraded an ecosystem is, like what we're seeing in the ash forest, the less flexibility you have to work in that system. Because if it's collapsing, it's not going to be producing much wood, along with biodiversity and other values. So the thing is, we need to put the brakes on that degradation first, reassess, and then put in a system. And James has provided, I think, an excellent example of where forestry can go in Australia. And we need to be looking at that, and governments need to be taken a lot more seriously too. Well, yeah, look, I'm not going to talk for James, but I've heard people from James's collective say that timber is a byproduct of an overall ecological restoration process. And that really encourages me. That's what we need to be seeing, as opposed to treating the forest as a crop, as a fibre crop, to meet legislative yields that are completely not sustainable.
I can't actually hear.
Oh, sorry, James, did you want to respond to that, James? And also,
Kat, I can't hear the questions coming from the floor.
oh, okay, sorry. That was a complex one. I think we've moved on from that one because we're almost out of time, to be honest.
No, that's fine. It's just if I'm being a bit mute, you know why.
Okay. There was a question directly to Paul Ha. You recommend sourcing locally grown plantation wood and avoid slow-growing northern hemisphere species, but what about tropical timber? Tropical smallholders are known to convert their forested land to farmland or pasture if an economic incentive for them for maintaining them is removed. You want to answer that one, Paul? And I think that might be almost our last question. It's 8:22. I think we had to finish up at 8:30. So, oh, and then there's an interesting question about the Wombat State Forest as well. Okay, could you answer that one for us, Paul? The first one, that you recommend sourcing locally grown. It's actually written there, so you can see it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, the mentioning of the northern boreal forests of the northern hemisphere, they are very slow growing, and their accrual of carbon, because architects love to think about carbon, is very, very slow. They grow it ranges depending on the altitude and the latitude. So the colder the climate and the higher up they are, the slower they grow. So that's an issue. So there are real concerns about that. And those forests, some of the very large ones, are collapsing as well through all sorts of climate drivers in climate change. The tropical forests are different again. There's actually, they tend to grow quite slowly. People would think, oh, because of the hot climate, they grow slowly, but the old tropical forests, the ones that haven't been disturbed, they've grown over many, many hundreds of years and thousands of years, those trees. So when we're using murbu and Manilkara, Kumaru from the Amazon, and ones from Southeast Asia, the murbu and the Manilkara as well, those timbers are growing on land, the soils are really quite lean. And when you take those trees out, those landscapes, they never really actually recover at all to their old condition pickers. So we really need to stop that outright. There are, it's a whole lot about that. Say, for example, in the Amazon, it's about politics. So in the Amazon, very conservative government that's been there for a long while, that has really made it quite difficult for even other countries to sort of support those small landholders that the question is asked around to not convert those forests into farmland. But I think now with the change in government, hopefully if it's a robust or sort of a durable government and doesn't sort of fall, that will be a lot better. And those kind of community-based management of these tropical rainforests also in places of Southeast Asia, that's a really worthwhile thing to support. And I know FSC has done an amount there as well to try to get some of those community-based forest managements to get real value for that, for any timber they do take out, but to do it in a restorative way, or at least not a way that annihilates those forests for all time. So I hope that answers that a bit.
I think we might be almost out of time. What are questions we have? Do you have any suggestions? Do you have any suggestions for methods to? I'm going to make this the last one. Do you have any suggestions for methods to communicate the value of using sustainable timbers to our clients, especially clients that are short on time or have a lack of interest? So do you have any suggestions for methods to communicate the value of using sustainable timbers to our clients, especially clients that are short on time or have a lack of interest? Okay, that's a hard one. That's a hard one for you guys to answer. How are you going to answer? Okay, Darcy, good work.
What me and my boss often chat about is that people love the story of timber. If they're using timber in anything that they can see, they obviously want to see it because it looks great and it's a wonderful resource, a wonderful product. So that's what excites me about our little QR code and the timber story, is to try and keep transparency in the story of that timber open, so that does engage people. And that, in my opinion, that's one way to sort of get people interested in using sustainable timber, is to sort of explain the story behind the timbers that might be used.
I know there are quite a few more questions there, but unless anybody else has any more questions, I'd just really like to thank you all for coming and listening to what has been a really in-depth discussion about timber. And a lot of this is quite dense, and so I'm really glad this has been recorded. But I'd really, really love to really give a warm thank you to these people who have given up a lot of their time and energy to come and talk to us. I don't think any of these people here, Darcy, Paul, Sue or Chris, actually live in the city. So I'm really particularly thankful for them coming all this way and putting all this time. And we have had a great many conversations regarding this. This has been an ongoing conversation for me and these people for quite a few months, and I'm incredibly grateful for your amazing knowledge, work and passionate commitment to a better world for us all. Thank you very much. And also for James coming in from northern New South Wales as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye all.